You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 4,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The storm didn't arrive. It manifested, tearing through Chicago's October sky like something with claws and purpose. Rain struck O'Malley's windows with the percussion of skeletal fingers, while wind howled through the spaces between buildings, creating harmonies that sounded almost like whispered names. The century-old pub trembled under nature's assault, its brick walls absorbing vibrations that seemed to penetrate bone deep. Tommy O'Brien had tended this bar for 17 years. Tonight felt different. Not just weather, this was expectation made manifest. The city holding its breath for something that had been inevitable since the first human learned to fear the dark. Inside, amber light carved out sanctuary against the pressing darkness. The classic rock station played Fleetwood Mac through an ancient radio, Stevie Nicks crooning about thunder and rain, while the real storm provided percussion. At 9:47 p.m. on Thursday, only the devoted remained. Pete Murphy nursing his third Guinness in the corner booth, his weathered hands steady, despite the newspaper trembling between them. Sarah and David Chen sharing nachos and wedding plans at table 4. Their whispered promises creating warmth in the cooling air. Richard Crane at the bar's far end, his divorce papers folded beneath a glass of bourbon that had become his confessor. The oak door opened against impossible resistance. The man who entered didn't walk. He materialized from the storm's heart, water cascading from his black coat in patterns that defied gravity. Tall and gaunt, perhaps 55, with iron hair and eyes that had catalogued too many horrors. His face bore geography of suffering, lines etched by sleepless nights, scars that suggested old burns, hands marked by work that left permanent reminders. He moved towards the bar's distant end with deliberate precision, each footstep creating echoes that lasted too long. When he removed his coat, revealing clothes somehow dry beneath, Tommy glimpsed the white collar at his throat, pristine as fresh snow against black fabric. "Evening, Father." Tommy's hand moved towards the bourbon without conscious thought. "Dominic." The voice carried old country music, Irish filtered through decades of education and something harder than time. The title feels premature these days. Tommy poured 3 fingers of Jameson. The stranger, Dominic, cradled the glass, like it contained salvation's last measure. For 37 minutes he sat motionless, except for occasional sips, studying his reflection in the mirror's depths. The reflection seemed older somehow, carrying burdens the man himself couldn't fully bear. The storm intensified. Ice began forming on windows' inner edges despite the heating system's protests. Pete glanced up from his paper, Irish intuition recognizing something beyond weather. The young couple's conversation died. Even Richard stopped pretending his phone held answers. Dominic spoke suddenly, his words cutting through ambient sound like prophecy through silence. "Tell me, have you ever entered a place that felt wrong before you'd taken 3 steps? Not haunted, wrong, like reality had been bent, slightly off true, and never snapped back, leaving everything forever askew?" Tommy set down his cloth. 17 years of bar stories had taught him to recognize something extraordinary brewing, but Dominic's tone carried weight that pressed against his chest, making breath come shallow. "Can't say I have, but you sound like authority on the subject." Dominic's laugh held no warmth, the sound of someone who'd seen cosmic punchlines and found them deeply unfunny. Father Dominic Reilly served God faithfully for 32 years until the church suggested I take what they called indefinite spiritual sabbatical. I specialised in cases that made official exorcists recommend career changes. He sipped whiskey, hands steadying with alcohol's burn. Not standard possessions, those follow predictable patterns, have established solutions. I handled the other things. Cases that made cardinals cross themselves twice, and bishops recommend filing everything under natural phenomena with insufficient documentation. The radio's static increased. Even the storm seemed to quiet, as if the weather itself was listening. Tonight I have nowhere else to go. And these stories... He paused, rolling the glass between scarred palms. They don't remain contained in human memory. They grow stronger in darkness, take root, spread like beautiful infections. Would you mind if I shared them? Might help you understand why I traded sanctuary for this bar stool. Tommy noticed the other patrons had stopped pretending not to listen. Pete folded his paper with deliberate care. Sarah and David held hands across their table, nachos cooling forgotten. Richard abandoned his phone entirely, moving 2 stools closer. We're listening. Thunder rolled overhead like celestial applause. Dominic stared into whiskey's amber depths, seeing something the rest couldn't perceive. When he spoke again, his voice carried confession's weight. 4 months ago, on a Tuesday that began like salvation and ended like damnation, Margaret Henderson called me, weeping. Farmers outside Millbrook, good Catholic family, 4 generations working the same soil, attending the same small church where her great-grandfather was baptized in 1889. The temperature dropped, perceptibly. Tommy poured himself whiskey, instinct suggesting he'd need fortification. For 18 days, Margaret told me through tears that split the soul, they'd found their cattle dead each morning. Not merely dead, arranged. 27 head of prize Angus, each one drained completely of blood, positioned in perfect concentric circles around an oak tree older than Illinois statehood. Dominic drained half his glass in one steady pull. But the cattle weren't simply killed. They were hollowed with surgical precision that confounded veterinary science. Organs removed so cleanly it suggested instruments beyond current medical technology. No wounds, no struggle signs, no evidence of conventional slaughter, as if something had reached inside and extracted everything that made them alive. Sarah made a small distress sound. David's protective embrace tightened, though his own face had paled. That wasn't the part that broke my sleep for months afterward. The Henderson farmhouse, built by Margaret's grandfather in 1923, solid as prairie faith, had developed a heartbeat. I realise how that sounds to rational minds, but I swear on my sister's memory that those walls pulsed with rhythm, like something immense pumping life through wooden veins. The pub's temperature plummeted further. Ice spread across windows in fractal patterns that definitely weren't random, spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with internal rhythm. Margaret's children, Billy, 12, Emma, 10, Joseph, 7, hadn't slept in their own beds for 19 nights. They huddled in their parents' room, too terrified for hallway journeys. Joseph had stopped speaking except for one repeated phrase, "The hungry dark is coming to dinner." Dominic gestured for another drink. Tommy poured without hesitation, noting the man's hands had achieved steadiness through alcohol or resignation. I drove to Henderson Farm Wednesday morning, telling myself this would be environmental contamination or mass hysteria, perhaps gas leaks causing shared hallucinations, maybe toxic mold affecting perception. I'd encountered such cases, rational people convinced they were experiencing supernatural phenomena when explanations were disappointingly mundane. His voice dropped to confession's whisper. The moment my feet touched their soil, I knew this defied every mundane explanation I'd ever encountered. The air felt thick as blood, carrying scents of copper and decay that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to evolutionary fear. Underneath lay something organic and alive that made my stomach clench with recognition of predators our ancestors had learned to flee. The radio static resolved briefly into what might have been children singing, then dissolved back into white noise. Pete had abandoned his Guinness entirely, weathered hands clasped like prayer. The soil itself was wrong, black and sodden despite the region's 3-month drought. When I knelt and touched it, my fingers came away stained with substance that wasn't quite earth. It was warm, body temperature, and seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the house's heartbeat. Tommy found himself leaning forward, despite rational mind's protests. Something in Dominic's precision, the careful measurement of his words, the haunted certainty in storm-grey eyes made disbelief feel like luxury he couldn't afford. Margaret met me at the door, and I saw immediately that sanity hung by gossamer threads. She'd lost 30 pounds, hair gone prematurely silver, eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd witnessed things human consciousness wasn't designed to process. Dominic rotated his glass, watching whiskey catch and refract the dying light. She led me inside to show me the marks, deep gouges carved into plaster and the wood beneath. Not random scratches, but deliberate patterns, forming intricate geometries that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. They appeared fresh each dawn, Margaret said, regardless of how many times they painted over them or filled them with putty. The patterns. Tommy could almost visualize them, though Dominic hadn't described them in detail. The very concept made his skin crawl with unnamed recognition. I established my equipment, blessed water, sanctified salt, prayer book, digital still recorder for documentation. Standard exorcism preparation, though instinct suggested this would be anything but standard. I began with simple blessings, walking through each room while reciting protection prayers and sanctification rituals. His voice acquired hollow quality, as if spoken from great depths. The words felt powerless, like trying to fill a punctured vessel. Each blessing seemed to worsen rather than improve conditions. Wall patterns grew deeper, more complex. The heartbeat grew stronger, more insistent, until I could feel it in my bones. He finished his drink with steady deliberation. That first night, sleeping in their guest room, I was awakened at 2:17 a.m. by children's laughter from the basement. Sweet, innocent sounds like kids playing elaborate games. Sarah's grip on David's hand tightened visibly. Richard had stopped pretending to drink, his glass untouched while he stared at Dominic with fascination and mounting dread. All 3 Henderson children were upstairs in their parents' bedroom, wide awake and trembling under blankets that couldn't provide warmth against whatever had invaded their home. I took flashlight and prayer book, descended to investigate, telling myself it had to be pipes or settling wood. The storm had grown eerily quiet, as if weather itself was holding breath. Tommy realized he could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden silence. The basement was finished in knotty pine with concrete floor, painted institutional grey. Unremarkable, except for temperature, 20 degrees colder than upstairs. Cold enough that breath came in visible clouds. But the laughter continued, seeming to emanate from within walls, beneath concrete, everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Dominic's voice dropped until it barely registered above whisper. I called out, following proper protocol for spiritual manifestations. The laughter stopped instantly, leaving silence so complete it caused physical pain. 30 seconds of nothingness. Then it resumed, but different. Still children's voices, but wrong somehow. Like someone who'd never heard children laugh, attempting to recreate the sound from second-hand description. The radio crackled with static that resolved briefly into what was definitely singing, multiple voices in harmony. before dissolving back into white noise. Tommy felt neck hair rising with primitive alarm. 4 more days I spent at Henderson Farm, performing every ritual I knew, consulting colleagues, even contacting scholars of ancient languages and folklore. Nothing worked. My presence seemed to strengthen whatever was happening, give it focus and purpose. Wall patterns began forming recognizable letters, then words, then complete sentences in languages that predated recorded history. Dominic looked directly at Tommy for the first time since beginning his tale. Storm grey eyes held depths that seemed infinite. Saturday morning of my second week, I woke to complete silence. No heartbeat, no scratching, no sounds whatsoever. The oppressive atmosphere had vanished, replaced by something worse. Absolute emptiness. He gestured towards his empty glass. Tommy hesitated, noting the man's eyes had acquired glassy quality, but something compelled him to pour another measure. The Henderson family was gone, vanished utterly, as if they'd never existed. But breakfast remained warm on the kitchen table, bacon still sizzling faintly. Emma's homework spread across dining room table, pencil marks wet. Joseph's stuffed bear sat on the couch, still retaining body heat. Temperature in O'Malley's plummeted further. Breath became visible clouds, and ice spread across windows in increasingly complex patterns. I searched every inch, calling their names, checking closets and crawl spaces. Nothing. In the basement, carved fresh into stone foundation. They came willingly, Father. Your turn approaches. Dominic stared into whiskey, as if it contained answers to questions he feared asking. I fled that farm like damnation pursued me. Later learned the property had been sold to developers, who bulldozed everything and trucked in new soil from 3 counties to build a shopping centre. His hands trembled again. Made inquiries through church connections. Official records showed no Henderson family had ever existed. No birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, erased not just from present but from history itself. Sarah and David had moved closer together, as if proximity could provide protection. Pete had abandoned newspaper entirely, listening with intensity of someone hearing his own judgment. That case should have destroyed me, but it was merely preparation. 6 months earlier, the church sent me to northern Spain, investigating reports from Valderas village. Picture-perfect location, in a valley surrounded by olive groves cultivated since Roman occupation. Friendly people, strong Catholic tradition, except for one subject nobody discussed. Dominic's accent became more pronounced, Irish lilt more apparent when speaking of distant places. San Estabban monastery crowned the highest hill, massive stone fortress housing Benedictine monks for 8 centuries. Built during crusades with walls capable of withstanding siege warfare, bell tower visible from 20 miles distance. The radio static had resolved into definite singing, beautiful harmonies that seemed to originate from vast distance. Tommy reached toward the dial, but Dominic shook his head. Leave it. Interference doesn't matter now. The singing continued, growing slightly louder while remaining at comprehension's edge. Melody was hauntingly beautiful and deeply unsettling simultaneously. In 1963, something occurred that the church has spent 60 years trying to erase from memory. 43 monks who'd taken lifetime vows simply abandoned their calling without explanation. Vatican investigators filed classified reports. Local bishop issued brief statement about administrative reorganization. Dominic rotated his glass, watching amber liquid catch and refract dim light. Locals understood better. Children were forbidden hill access after sunset. Dogs whimpered and retreated when led toward monastery path. Birds wouldn't nest in surrounding trees. Olive groves on that specific hill produced fruit so bitter it was inedible. Temperature had dropped enough that everyone was shivering. Sarah pulled her coat tighter. David rubbed her arms, trying to generate warmth. Richard had moved to the stool beside Tommy, abandoning pretense of casual interest. I hiked to San Estabban Tuesday afternoon in perfect October weather. The structure was more imposing up close. Walls rising 40 feet, carved from stone so dark it appeared nearly black. Main gate stood open, which should have warned me. His voice acquired nightmare quality, the tone of someone reliving their worst memory. Crossing the threshold, I immediately knew something was fundamentally wrong. Air inside felt thick as syrup, carrying centuries-old incense mixed with organic decay that turned my stomach. Tommy noticed condensation on his glass was moving, sliding sideways in perfectly straight lines, despite the bar being level. Monastery walls bore marks unlike anything I'd encountered. Not scratches or burns, but deep gouges seemingly pushed outward from within, as if something enormous had attempted to claw free from the building itself. They covered every surface, forming patterns that caused discomfort when contemplated directly. The singing from radio had become constant background, no longer beautiful but definitely hypnotic. Melody seemed to burrow into Tommy's brain, making him want to hum along, despite not knowing tune or understanding its significance. Inside, everything remained exactly as monks had left it 40 years prior. Beds made with military precision, sharp enough corners to draw blood. Books lay open on reading tables with bookmarks in place. Meals sat on dining hall plates covered by decades of dust but perfectly preserved underneath. Dominic gestured toward radio, which now produced sounds definitely not originating from any earthly broadcast. Individual cells were most unsettling, each monk's space frozen in time. Prayer books open to specific psalms, rosaries arranged in perfect spirals, personal effects positioned with obsessive care. They'd intended to return momentarily and simply forgotten. The storm outside had synchronized with radio singing, creating symphony of wind, rain, and inhuman voices that seemed orchestrated by impossible intelligence. The bell tower provided first real clue about San Esteban's fate. Massive bronze bell weighing 2 tons hung from ancient ropes. The ropes had been severed cleanly with single stroke from impossibly sharp blade. He flexed scarred hands. That bell was swaying despite complete absence of wind or vibration. Cut ropes hung motionless, but the bell moved like pendulum, marking time to cosmic rhythm only it could perceive. The singing had become clearer, definitely children's choir, but harmonies too complex for human children, words bypassing ears to speak directly to brainstem. My first night in Abbott's quarters, sparse room with narrow bed and single window, I was awakened midnight by voices singing in chapel. Dozens of them in perfect harmony, music that made souls ache with longing for something indefinable. Tommy held his breath. Even Pete leaned forward, weathered face creased with concentration and mounting terror. I followed the sound through stone corridors to the chapel, masterpiece of medieval architecture with vaulted ceilings, soaring into darkness, stained glass depicting saints' lives in jewel-bright colours. Dominic's voice dropped to barely audible whisper. Chapel appeared empty, but singing continued from everywhere and nowhere. I looked up into rafters, 60 feet above altar. Lights in O'Malley's flickered once, twice. In that brief darkness, Tommy glimpsed shapes moving near the ceiling. Tall, angular forms that shouldn't exist. 15 figures perched on wooden beams like enormous birds. Human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin. Limbs bending in impossible directions. Mouths hung open, wide, moving in perfect synchronization, as if producing that beautiful, terrible singing. Sarah buried her face against David's shoulder. Richard had gone paper pale, hands gripping his glass until knuckles went white. When I illuminated them directly, they didn't disappear, like hallucinations. They turned their heads in mechanical unison, and looked down at me. Their eyes were voids, not black, but absent, like staring into space between stars. Temperature plummeted another 10 degrees. Ice spread across windows in patterns that definitely moved when viewed peripherally. The moment those things focused on me, temperature dropped 40 degrees in 10 seconds. Thick breath clouds, ice forming on every surface. Stained glass cracked from thermal shock, creating fractures that seemed to spell words in that ancient script I'd encountered at Henderson Farm. He finished his drink and set glass down with shaking hands. I tried leaving, packed with numb fingers, and headed for main entrance. Every door had somehow fused shut, not locked, but sealed as if wood and stone had grown together, like living tissue. The singing had resolved into actual words now, though in no earthly language. Melody was hypnotic, pulling at something deep in Tommy's mind, making him want to join despite not understanding lyrics. Trapped in San Estabban for 7 hours, while those things sang inhuman hymns and the great bell swayed without ropes to move it. Each toll sent vibrations through stone, air, bones. I felt it in chest, skull, behind eyes, like my body was being used as tuning fork. He held up his left hand, showing scars across knuckles and palm. Finally desperate enough to smash second-story window and jump 40 feet to rocky hillside. Broke ribs, wrist, collarbone, but escaped alive. Storm outside had synchronized completely with radio singing, creating symphony that seemed orchestrated by impossible intelligence. Tommy found himself swaying slightly to rhythm. Limping down that hill, bleeding and shocked, I could still hear the bell tolling. But I could see lights in monastery windows, warm yellow light like candles. Shadows moving behind glass, human forms going about evening routines, as if nothing had happened. Dominic looked directly at Tommy, storm-grey eyes infinite in depth. Called Vatican that night, filed report with Office of Sacred Investigations. Know what they told me? San Estabban had been destroyed by fire in 1963. According to official records, nothing remained but ruins and foundation stones. Lights flickered again, shadows reaching towards their small circle of illumination like grasping fingers. But San Estabban wasn't the case that broke me. That honor belongs to Timothy Walsh, age 8, of Boston, Massachusetts. The boy who taught me that some victories are defeats. Some souls are lost before battles begin. The name hung in air like curse. Even radio singing seemed to pause, as if whatever produced those sounds was listening with interest. Last month, rainy Thursday like this one, Dr. Patricia Brennan from St. Mary's Hospital called. Head of pediatric psychiatry, 20 years experience with disturbed children, but Timothy Walsh had pushed her beyond medical science into territory without names. Tommy poured himself another whiskey, despite hands surprisingly steady. Something suggested he'd need courage for what came next. Timothy had been perfectly normal, good grades, Little League baseball, helped his mother with groceries. The kind of child who said please and thank you, and remembered to feed his goldfish every morning. Then, Tuesday in early September, he attacked his third-grade teacher with impossible strength. Storm's rhythm matched Tommy's heartbeat now, creating synchronization both comforting and deeply unsettling. Everyone was breathing in unison, exhalations creating small clouds in frigid air. Mrs. Davidson was a sturdy woman in her 50s, experienced with difficult children. Timothy picked her up and threw her across classroom like she weighed nothing, broke her arm in 3 places, cracked 4 ribs, concussion severe enough for week-long intensive care. Dominic's voice carried weight of someone who'd witnessed too much. They sedated Timothy, brought him to St. Mary's for evaluation. Dr. Brennan discovered the boy who'd spoken only English for 8 years was now fluent in languages he'd never encountered. Radio singing had become constant background, no longer beautiful but hypnotic. Melody seemed to burrow into brains, making them want to hum along, despite not knowing tune. Aramaic, medieval Latin, and something else entirely. Something that made recording equipment malfunction during documentation attempts. Timothy would speak for hours in ancient tongues, child's voice carrying authority and cadence of someone much older, more learned. Dominic gestured toward radio, now producing sounds definitely not from earthly broadcast. Dr. Brennan showed me Timothy's artwork, dozens of drawings, created simultaneously, with both hands, perfect mirror images of impossible architecture and burning landscapes. Always the same towering figure with too many limbs, features shifting depending on viewing angle. Temperature had dropped until breath was thick clouds. Ice spread across windows in patterns that definitely weren't random, spirals and geometric shapes pulsing with internal rhythm. Timothy's physical condition was changing in ways defying medical explanation, spine curving into S-shape, allowing nearly complete head rotation, fingers growing longer, more articulated, developing extra joints providing uncanny dexterity, eyes gone completely black, not iris but entire visible surface like looking into midnight water. Tommy leaned forward despite every instinct screaming run. Something compelling about Dominic's story pulled at deepest mind parts, demanding attention. During day, Timothy remained recognizable, scared child crying for mother, begging doctors and nurses for help. At night, something else looked through his face, something ancient, patient, completely without human mercy or understanding. Lights flickered again, darkness lasting longer. Tommy heard movement, not from known patrons, but from somewhere that shouldn't exist within pub confines. I arrived St. Mary's Wednesday morning, Halloween week approaching. Timothy was restrained with leather straps, but I could tell immediately they were theatrical. Whatever inhabited that child's body could break free any time it chose. It was playing games, following rules only it understood. When lights returned, shadows had changed. Deeper, more three-dimensional, Tommy could swear he saw movement within them. Shapes almost familiar, but fundamentally wrong. The thing wearing Timothy's face knew me instantly. It smiled with 8-year-old features and spoke in voice like grinding stone. "Hello, Father Dominic, Francis Reilly. We've been waiting for your arrival." Dominic's hands trembled, not from cold this time. This was reliving worst nightmare. Moment when faith and sanity cracked beyond repair. It knew impossible things about my past. My sister's name who drowned at age 12. Prayers whispered in darkness after mother's funeral. Doubts never shared about God's existence and suffering's purpose in the world. Radio singing had become chorus now. Dozens of voices in harmonies, seeming to originate from vast distance. Underneath beauty lay hunger that made Tommy's skin crawl. I began traditional exorcism rites, starting with protection and binding prayers. But this wasn't like previous cases. The entity wasn't possessing Timothy Walsh. It was replacing him cell by cell, memory by memory, soul by soul. Storm outside had become something beyond weather. Rain fell in perfect rhythm. Wind created harmonies matching radio singing. Thunder came at precise intervals, creating symphony that seemed orchestrated by impossible intelligence. Hospital room walls began weeping, actual blood tears seeping from paint and plaster, running in rivers forming letters in that ancient script I'd encountered at farm and monastery. Copper smell filled air until I tasted it, metallic and warm like swallowing pennies. Temperature had dropped until Tommy's whiskey developed ice skin. Breath came in clouds lingering longer than physics allowed, forming shapes almost resembling faces. Timothy's body changed during ritual itself. Limbs stretched and contorted, bones shifting, beneath skin like living things trying to escape. Spine curved and twisted until he could look behind without turning torso. Leather restraints designed for 8-year-olds snapped like paper. Pete had begun muttering prayers, weathered hands clasped until knuckles went white. Sarah cried silently, tears freezing on cheeks. David held her protectively, his own face masked with terror and fascination. The thing wearing Timothy's face spoke in my sister's voice, asking why I hadn't saved her from the lake 43 years ago. Then Mother's voice, wondering why I'd chosen priesthood instead of staying home during her final illness. Every doubt, failure, weakness moment, it knew them intimately. Radio singing had become so loud it drowned storm outside, but somehow Dominic's voice remained audible, as if his words were carried by something other than air. Ritual's climax saw Timothy's hospital bed fold in half, like cardboard instead of steel and aluminum. His body convulsed with violence that made spine sound like breaking branches. Screams shattered every 7th floor window, set off car alarms 6 stories below. Lights went out completely, plunging pub into absolute darkness. But somehow Dominic's words continued being visible, not heard but seen, written across darkness in fire letters burning into Tommy's retinas. Fluorescent lights exploded in sequence, showering sparks and glass. Cardiac monitors flatlined, not because the boy was dying, but because whatever replaced him didn't have human heart to monitor. Emergency lighting cast hellish red shadows revealing truth. In darkness, shapes moved, not familiar patron forms, but something else, tall, angular figures, existing in spaces between spaces, visible only when not viewed directly. Timothy Walsh died 3:33 a.m. October 30th, but the thing looking up from his hospital bed was very much alive, wearing his face like discardable mask. It smiled with his features, spoke in his voice. "Thank you, Father Reilly. You've been most helpful completing the transition." Cold had become absolute, beyond broken heating or open doors. This was deep space, cold, void between stars cold, places where warmth and light never existed. Tommy's whiskey glass froze solid, amber liquid turned to ice glowing with internal light. As they wheeled Timothy's body away on sheet-covered gurney, it turned toward me one last time. Sheet fell, revealing not 8-year-old boy's face, but something else. Features flowing like water, eyes holding eternity's depth, smile promising things worse than death. Radio singing had become words chanted by hundreds of voices. Language was that ancient tongue Dominic encountered at all locations. Though Tommy couldn't understand meaning, he felt its purpose bone deep. Summoning, invitation, door opening between worlds. It whispered my full name, Dominic Francis Reilly, including confirmation name I'd never told anyone at that hospital. Then it said something still echoing in dreams. "The boy wanted to come with us, Father. When your time arrives, will you be as willing?" Shapes moving in O'Malley's darkness were becoming defined, coalescing into forms painful to perceive directly. Tommy caught glimpses peripherally, too tall, too thin, joints bending impossibly, faces almost human but fundamentally wrong. Church transferred me quietly afterward. Sealed records suggested indefinite leave for occupational stress disorder. Dr. Brennan transferred to Alaska Research Facility, St. Mary's 7th floor, converted to administrative offices. When lights flickered back, pub looked different. Walls seemed farther, ceiling higher, familiar space stretched and distorted. Other patrons remained, Pete, Sarah and David, Richard, but sat frozen like mannequins, eyes reflecting amber light like mirrors. But attracted attention didn't disappear with my collar. Problem with fighting demons. They remember you. They follow. They wait. Eventually they collect what's owed. Front door swung open despite being locked and bolted. No wind entered, just darkness with substance and weight, flowing across floor like oil shadow. Radio singing reached crescendo, making building windows rattle. Timothy Walsh sends his regards. Seems he's been searching for me since that Boston night. The boy always was persistent. That much original personality survived transition. In doorway, something small began taking shape, initially resembling child silhouetted against stormy night. But as it stepped into light, illusion dissolved. The thing wearing Timothy's form moved with jerky, unnatural gait of marionette, controlled by inexperienced puppeteer. Its head tilted at angles that would snap human necks, smile too wide for its face. Henderson Farm, San Estabban Monastery, Timothy Walsh, all connected, parts of something much larger, much older. Tests determining if I was worthy of their attention. Apparently I passed each one. Timothy Thing stepped fully into O'Malley's, temperature dropping, until whiskey bottles cracked from thermal stress. Its voice, when it spoke, was wind through empty houses and rain on abandoned graves. "Hello, Father Reilly. We've travelled such distances to find you." Dominic stood from his bar stool with movements suggesting exhaustion and acceptance. "I know. I've been running for months, but you can't outrun something existing outside space and time. What do you want from me?" Timothy Thing's smile widened further, revealing teeth definitely not human. Too many, too sharp, arranged in patterns suggesting mouth designed for purposes other than eating or speaking. Same thing we wanted from Henderson family. Same thing we wanted from San Estabban monks. Same thing we wanted from the boy. It gestured with multi-jointed arms toward frozen patrons. Permission. Tommy tried moving, speaking, anything other than standing paralyzed behind his bar, watching impossible conversation unfold. But his body no longer belonged to him. He was spectator in his own flesh, able to observe but not participate. "You see, Father, we cannot simply take what we desire. Rules governing our existence require invitation, consent, willingness. Henderson's invited us by remaining on corrupted land despite all warnings. Monks invited us through prideful certainty that faith could protect them from anything. Young Timothy invited us through innocent curiosity about darkness living in every human heart." Dominic nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "How did I invite you?" Timothy Thing began changing, features flowing like melted wax. Momentarily, Tommy saw other faces. Margaret Henderson weeping in her kitchen, San Estabban's abbot kneeling in prayer, Dr. Brennan screaming as her patient transformed into something impossible by bearing witness, Father, by carrying our stories from place to place, person to person. Every time you described Henderson Farm, you planted reality doubt seeds. Every time you mentioned San Estabban, you opened minds to previously unconsidered possibilities. Every time you spoke Timothy's name, you gave us foothold in their thoughts. Realization hit Dominic like physical blow. Face went pale, he staggered against bar. The stories, they were never just stories, they were invitations, infections, both, neither. Something more fundamental. Timothy Thing's voice became chorus, speaking in harmonies suggesting multiple entities sharing same mouth. Stories have power, Father. They shape reality, bend laws of what is and isn't possible. Your stories, told with such conviction and detail, such beautiful terror, they've opened doors we could never have opened ourselves. Tommy felt perspective shifting, expanding, until he saw not just O'Malley's, but entire city spreading around them. In windows throughout Chicago, people listened to radios playing impossible songs. In bars and coffee shops and living rooms, people told same stories Dominic had shared. Henderson Farm, San Estabban, Timothy Walsh. Each telling opened another crack in reality's foundation. You've been our most effective missionary, Father Dominic Francis Reilly. Every person hearing your tales and feeling that delicious possibility chill. Every mind wondering, what if such things could be real? They've all issued invitations in their own way. Frozen patrons began moving again. but movements were wrong, synchronized, like actors following scripts they'd never seen. Pete stood from corner booth, newspaper dissolving into ash spelling words in ancient languages. Sarah and David rose from table, holding hands but walking with wind-up toy precision. The boy you knew as Timothy Walsh was just beginning. Single thread in tapestry, we've been weaving longer than your species has had language describing time. But you, Father, you've helped us add countless new threads to the pattern. Richard walked toward Bar with frost footprint steps. Reaching Tommy's side, he turned facing Dominic, with eyes holding same infinite depth as Timothy thing. Everyone hearing your stories, Richard said in voice like breaking glass. Everyone feeling reality, doubt moments. They've been prepared, softened, made ready for our work's next phase. Tommy realized with growing horror that he could feel his rational world faith crumbling with each word. Detailed, vivid stories Dominic shared weren't just accounts of impossible events. They were instruction manuals, belief blueprints in things that shouldn't exist. By believing, even momentarily, he'd opened himself to possibilities normal minds rejected. Henderson Farm exists now because people believe it existed, Pete said, Irish accent, identical to Dominic's as he spoke, words seeming to originate elsewhere. San Estabban stands solid and real because minds have conceived its stone walls and impossible geometry. Timothy Walsh walks among living because his story has been given life through repetition and belief. Sarah and David flanked Dominic, young faces serene and terrible in absolute certainty. When Sarah spoke, it was with Margaret Henderson's voice. We came willingly, Father, because stories you told made willing sound like the only rational choice. Every tale creates its own truth, David added, in the abbot's ancient tones. Every listener becomes a participant. Every believer becomes a doorway through which we can finally step into your reality. The Timothy thing raised one impossible hand, and the singing from the radio reached a crescendo that made reality itself seem to vibrate like a struck bell. The very air in O'Malley's began to shimmer, as if the boundary between what was real and what was story had become negotiable. Thank you, Father Reilly, for spreading our gospel so faithfully. Thanks to your evangelical work, we no longer need to hide in the spaces between spaces, feeding on scraps of fear and doubt. We can walk openly in your world, invited guests in the house of human consciousness. Dominic looked around at the transformed faces surrounding him, and Tommy saw the moment when the former priest finally grasped the true scope of what he'd accomplished. Every person he'd told these stories to, every listener who'd felt that chill of possibility, had become a conduit for something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. How many? Dominic whispered, his voice barely audible, above the impossible chorus. Thousands, the Timothy thing replied, with obvious satisfaction. Tens of thousands, every soul in this city who's heard your tales these past months, every friend they've shared them with, every family member who's listened with growing unease. Stories spread like ripples on water, and each ripple opens another crack in the wall between what is and what could be. Tommy watched the walls of O'Malley's begin to change, stretching and flowing like melted plastic. The familiar pub was becoming something else, a space that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. Through the transforming windows, he could see not the Chicago street he'd known for 17 years, but glimpses of other places. A farmhouse with walls that pulsed like a living heart. A monastery perched on a Spanish hillside where impossible figures sang in empty rafters. A hospital room where something that had once been a child drew pictures of burning worlds. The barriers between stories and reality were always thinner than your species believed, Richard explained with mechanical precision, his insurance adjuster's mind now serving as a vessel for ancient intelligence. Narrative has power, the power to reshape perception, and perception shapes reality more than most people realize. Your detailed accounts didn't just describe these events, Father. They made them more real with every telling. Tommy felt his own memories shifting, rearranging themselves to accommodate new truths. Had he always known about the Henderson farm? Had he grown up hearing stories about San Estabban from his grandmother, who'd immigrated from Spain decades ago? Had he read about Timothy Walsh in newspapers that definitely hadn't existed yesterday but felt completely authentic now? The beautiful thing about stories, old Pete said with Dominic's voice emerging from his weathered throat, is that once they're told with sufficient conviction and detail, they take on a life of their own. They don't need their original teller to keep existing. They become part of the collective unconscious, part of the shared mythology that shapes how people understand the world. The Timothy thing began to grow, its childlike form stretching and expanding until it filled half the transformed space. Its features became more fluid, more abstract, until it was less like a person and more like a living shadow that happened to wear a human face when it remembered to do so. Which brings us to the question of your reward, Father Dominic Francis Reilly. You've served us so faithfully, spread our influence so effectively. What would you like in return for becoming the evangelist of impossibility? Dominic laughed, and the sound held notes of hysteria and relief in equal measure. Reward? You want to reward me for accidentally becoming a recruiter for entities that shouldn't exist? For unknowingly spreading contagious stories that infected thousands of minds with belief in things that defy every natural law? You could see it as infection, Sarah said with Margaret Henderson's voice, her young features radiating a serenity that was deeply unsettling. Or you could see it as liberation. Liberation from the narrow confines of a reality that insists only certain things are possible. Liberation from the tyranny of a universe that claims to operate according to fixed laws and immutable principles. We offer expansion, David added in the abbot's timeless cadence. The chance to see beyond the veil that separates the mundane from the miraculous. The opportunity to exist in all stories simultaneously. To be part of every tale that's ever been told, or ever will be told. The walls of O'Malley's had become transparent now, revealing infinite layers of reality stacked like pages in an endless book. Tommy could see other versions of this conversation happening in other bars, other cities, other times. Countless Dominic Reillys telling their stories to countless listeners, each telling creating new fractures in the foundation of consensus reality. But there was something else in those infinite reflections, something that filled Tommy with a hope he hadn't realized he'd lost. In some of those other realities, different choices were being made. Different endings were being written. Join us willingly, the Timothy thing whispered, its voice now coming from every surface in the transformed space. Become part of the stories you've told so beautifully. Live forever in the spaces between fiction and fact, dream and nightmare, possibility and certainty. Dominic stood silent for a long moment, surrounded by the transformed patrons of O'Malley's. Tommy could see the conflict playing out across his weathered features. The desire for escape from guilt and responsibility, warring with whatever remained of his human conscience. The people who heard my stories, Dominic finally said, his voice cutting through the impossible symphony that had filled the air. The ones who believed, who opened their minds to these possibilities. What happens to them in this new reality you're creating? They become part of something larger than themselves, Richard replied with inhuman calm. Part of a narrative that spans dimensions, encompasses all possibilities, includes every tale that was ever whispered in the dark or dreamed in fevered sleep. They transcend the limitations of individual existence. They lose themselves, Dominic translated flatly. They find themselves, old Pete corrected, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. Find their place in the grand narrative that connects all stories, all realities, all possibilities. They become characters in a story so vast and complex that their individual suffering becomes meaningless in the context of cosmic beauty. Tommy felt his own identity beginning to fray around the edges, becoming less solid, more fluid. Was he Tommy O'Brien, bartender at O'Malley's? Or was he just a character in a story being told by Father Dominic Reilly in some other version of reality? Had he ever really existed? Or was he simply a narrative device in a tale designed to spread itself to new listeners? But then, in that moment of existential dissolution, Tommy felt something else. A thread of connection to something real and solid, and undeniably his own. His 17 years behind this bar. The regulars he'd served and listened to and cared about. His sister in Milwaukee who called every Sunday. His small apartment with its stack of unread books and half-finished crossword puzzles. The accumulated weight of a life lived, choices made, relationships built. These things were real because he had made them real through the simple act of living them, believing in them, caring about them. And if his life could be real despite existing in a universe where impossible things were apparently possible, then maybe reality was more resilient than these entities believed. The Timothy thing extended what might have been a hand towards Dominic. Choose, Father. Join us willingly and help guide the transformation of your world into something more interesting than the mundane reality your species has settled for. Or resist and watch helplessly as the stories you've already told continue to spread and change things, regardless of your wishes. Dominic looked at the offered hand, then around at the faces of the people who'd been listening to his tales. Tommy saw something shift in his expression. Not resignation, but a kind of grim determination that Tommy recognized from his years serving people who'd hit rock bottom and decided to fight their way back up. "You know what?" Dominic said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I think you're wrong about something fundamental. You claim that stories have the power to reshape reality, and maybe they do, but you've forgotten something important about stories." The Timothy thing tilted its head at an impossible angle, its too wide smile faltering slightly. "What could we have forgotten? We are stories, Father. We exist in the spaces between words, in the pauses between sentences, in the silence that follows the final page." Dominic smiled, and for the first time since entering O'Malley's, his expression held genuine warmth. "You've forgotten that every story has an ending, and more importantly, you've forgotten that the person telling the story gets to choose what that ending is." The impossible symphony filling the air began to falter, discordant notes creeping into the previously perfect harmonies. The transparent walls of the transformed pub flickered, occasionally revealing glimpses of the ordinary bar it had been. "I've been telling your story," Dominic continued, his voice gaining power and authority with each word. "But it's still my story to tell, and I think it's time for a different ending." Tommy felt something shift in the fabric of reality itself. The endless reflections of other conversations in other realities began to change, as if Dominic's words were rippling outward through all possible versions of this moment. "In the story I'm telling," Dominic said, standing straighter now, his clerical bearing returning, "these entities feed on belief and fear and the willing surrender of human agency. But they have a weakness. They need permission. They need people to choose to believe in them, to invite them in." The Timothy thing began to shrink, its expanded form contracting as if something was draining its power. This is not how stories work. Once told, they cannot be untold. Once believed, they cannot be disbelieved. "Maybe not," Dominic admitted, "but they can be reframed. They can be given new contexts, new meanings. The Henderson family, San Estabban, Timothy Walsh. What if those weren't stories about inevitable doom and the helplessness of human will? What if they were stories about the importance of choice, about the power we have to say no to things that want to consume us?" Tommy felt his sense of self solidifying again, the threads of his identity weaving back together. He was Tommy O'Brien, and he chose to be Tommy O'Brien. And that choice had power. In the story I'm telling now, Dominic continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a priest delivering a sermon. People heard my tales and felt fear, yes. But they also felt something else, the recognition that they had a choice. They could choose to believe or not to believe. They could choose to invite these things in or turn them away. The transformed patrons of O'Malley's began to look confused, their synchronized movements becoming uncertain. Pete's newspaper reappeared in his hands, no longer ash, but ordinary newsprint. Sarah and David looked at each other with their own eyes, their own voices returning. And in the story I'm telling, Dominic said, his voice now ringing with authority that seemed to come from something deeper than personal conviction, the people of Chicago make a different choice. They hear these tales and say, collectively, and with one voice, no, you are not welcome here. We do not invite you. We do not consent. We choose reality over fantasy, hope over despair, connection over isolation. The Timothy thing let out a sound that was part shriek, part wail of frustration. You cannot simply narrate us out of existence. We are real now. We have been believed into being. You are real, Dominic agreed, but your power over us is not. That was always an illusion, a trick of storytelling that made you seem more powerful than you actually are. You can exist in the spaces between spaces, but you cannot force your way into our world without invitation, and I hereby rescind every invitation my stories might have accidentally extended. The walls of O'Malley's snapped back to their normal configuration with an almost audible sound. The impossible symphony cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of rain against windows and the gentle hum of the heating system. The temperature began to rise toward normal levels. Tommy looked around at the other patrons. Pete was reading his newspaper again, looking confused but essentially himself. Sarah and David were holding hands and whispering to each other, but their words were their own. Richard was staring into his whiskey with the expression of someone who'd just woken from a very strange dream. The Timothy thing was still there, but it was shrinking rapidly, its form becoming less solid with each passing moment. This is not possible. Stories do not work this way. Maybe they don't, Dominic said, settling back onto his bar stool with visible relief. But faith does. And I have faith in something more powerful than stories. I have faith in human choice, in the power of free will, in the ability of people to say no to things that want to consume them. The former priest looked directly at Tommy, his storm grey eyes clear and focused for the first time all evening. Thank you for listening. I needed to tell those stories not to spread them, but to rob them of their power. By speaking them aloud in the presence of witnesses who could choose how to respond, I've given them a different ending than the one they wanted. The Timothy thing made one last, desperate attempt, reaching towards Dominic with rapidly fading arms. You cannot deny us. We are part of the story now. We exist. You exist, Dominic agreed calmly, but you exist as what you always were, parasites that feed on fear and hopelessness. And I'm no longer afraid, and I'm no longer hopeless. I choose to believe in redemption, in second chances, in the power of human beings to resist things that want to diminish them. The entity that had worn Timothy's face flickered once more, and then vanished entirely, leaving only the faintest echo of children's laughter that might have been coming from the street outside. Tommy realized he was holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, watching the condensation from his breath form and dissipate normally. The ice on the windows was melting, running down in ordinary rivulets of water. Did that really just happen? He asked. Dominic smiled and finished the whiskey. Tommy had poured what felt like hours ago. That depends on what story you choose to believe. In one version, a broken ex-priest came into your bar and told some scary stories that got a bit out of hand. In another version, we just saved the city from entities that exist in the spaces between fiction and reality. He stood up and put on his coat, which was somehow dry now despite the rain still falling outside. Either way, I think Chicago is going to be just fine. People here are tougher than they look. They don't give up easily, and they don't let outsiders push them around. Even outsiders that shouldn't technically exist. As Dominic headed toward the door, Tommy called after him, Dominic, are you going to be all right?" The former priest paused with his hand on the door handle. "I think so. For the first time in months, I feel like I might actually be all right. Turns out the best way to fight monsters isn't with holy water or ancient rituals. It's with the simple conviction that they don't get to win." He stepped out into the rain, and Tommy watched through the window as he walked down the street, shoulders straight and head held high. Within moments, he was lost in the darkness between street lights. Tommy turned back to his bar, where life was slowly returning to normal. Pete was grumbling about the weather and ordering another Guinness. Sarah and David were making wedding plans again, their earlier fear already fading into the category of strange things that happen sometimes. Richard was settling his tab, looking like a man who'd decided to cut himself off for the evening. "Hell of a storm," Pete commented, glancing toward the windows where the rain was already starting to lighten. "Yeah," Tommy agreed, pouring the old man's pint with steady hands. "But it's passing now. They always do." As he worked, Tommy found himself thinking about stories and reality, about the power of choice and the importance of knowing when to say no. He thought about the difference between being a victim of circumstances and being the author of your own life. And when the last customer had gone home, and he was alone in the pub, cleaning glasses and preparing to close up, Tommy O'Brien made a choice. He chose to believe that what had happened tonight was real, and that it mattered, and that sometimes ordinary people in ordinary places could do extraordinary things simply by refusing to give up. Outside, Chicago slept peacefully under clearing skies, its 8 million residents dreaming dreams that were entirely their own. The story was over, but the choice to keep it that way would continue every single day, made by every single person who decided that reality, messy and complicated and sometimes disappointing as it was still worth believing in. And that, Tommy thought as he turned off the lights and locked the door behind him, was the most powerful story of all.